Let's talk about these hit rules because there's a number of issues with not just the rules, but the way that they're being interpreted, as well as what the NFL is saying about them, in addition to what the commentators on TV are saying about them. First and foremost, the rule, as it is written, only legislates against lowering the helmet. If you read the rule itself, which I'll flash up here, in multiple places it talks about lowering the head. That's all it is. It has nothing to do with other types of hits. This new rule specifically is that you cannot lower the head to initiate contact. It doesn't matter where the contact is, it's just the simple act of lowering your head. That's what this rule legislates against. So first, let's talk about the commentators. We see multiple commentators on the games. Some of them are ultra complaining about the rules. Others are joking about the rules. They're saying as if that they've been described to them and they're just interpreting the way that they were described. But you look at a guy on one of the first games of the season where Chris Collinsworth goes in and tries to explain this hit and tries to argue on behalf of the officials, even though this particular incident should clearly not have been a penalty because the defensive player does not lower his head. But look at the explanation.
Take a look. Lower his head. Helmet on the arm, shoulder area.
Then we have this play on Monday Night Football last night where with the Redskins and the Jets, the defender clearly is lowering his helmet to cause contact. The offensive player likewise is lowering his helmet.
I don't know that that falls in line with what we've been seeing a lot in the examples of what they're trying to enforce.
And yet, the announcer, Joe Tessitore, makes it seem like this flag should not have been thrown whatsoever, when in fact, the reality is this should have been offsetting penalties. So first and foremost, I don't see these commentators doing any benefit, and I think they need to be retrained by the network and potentially the NFL as to what the definition of this rule is. It's about lowering the helmet, and if the players do that, there should be a flag thrown. Next, let's talk about how this is currently being implemented by the league. From what we've heard, the league has come out and said that they're going to be overly aggressive and throw flags on almost anything and then go back and review everything before the start of the season and decide whether or not those should have been flags. That is the most ridiculous way to implement this rule. You should be trying to get your referees on a game-by-game basis to make the right calls, period. They need to learn and be coached up after the game, whether what they called was incorrect or correct by the rule of the law as it currently exists, and then decide before the start of the season, are they going to change the law? But by not doing that and just suggesting that the referees should throw flags when anything's questionable, that's not going to help the officials learn from their mistakes and get better throughout the course of the preseason. In addition, it's not going to help the players figure out what will or will not be tolerated and make it so that it's called as consistently as possible throughout the course of the preseason. Don't err on the side of caution, just call it correctly. And then what we're seeing is they're not even calling it cautionary. They're not even going over the top and flagging everything. Look at this hit in the Redskins-Patriots game, week 1 of the season. You literally have 4 players in consecutive order lowering their helmets and hitting one another. And these both should have been, in my opinion, there should have been 4 flags here and it should have been offsetting penalties if we're talking about calling the rules by the letter of the law. Each of these players is lowering their helmet and initiating contact with their opposing player. That's a penalty by this rule. So the league saying that they're being over the top throwing everything, they're actually not. They're not being consistent whatsoever with what they're flagging. Oftentimes, they're not flagging anything when things should be flagged by the definition of the rule. Next, let's talk about this rule itself and the way that it's being implemented and potential ramifications during the regular season. Look, many of these hits that you're seeing are actually dangerous and they are trying to get those out of the game. So I don't have an issue with when a player is lowering his helmet and spearing the top part of his helmet into a defensive player and cannot see that player because he's literally spearing that player. That should be out of the game. I'm okay with that. The problem is there's too much of a gray area with this. There's times when there's a tackle that's not even forcible whatsoever and there's no really intent to lower the helmet, like we saw with the Arizona Cardinals play right here. That should not be a penalty in my opinion. That is not really enforcing the spirit of this rule. Is this rule going to make it more difficult on the defense? Obviously it will be, but the fact of the matter is they need to be calling this rule against offensive players just as often as they're calling it against defensive players. If you have a player on offense who has the ball and is carrying it and lowers his head to try to brace himself for a tackle, that should be a penalty if we're calling things by the letter of the rule. But the referees rarely are calling them against the offensive players, when in fact they should be. And they need to start doing so that the offensive players can figure out the right way that they're supposed to run with the football. It's one thing if a guy's running through the open field hunched over with his head down, but if he braces himself for contact and lowers his head, that's when that should be a penalty against the offense as well. How many times in the past several years have we seen incidents where a player is concussed and you say, well, there's no real thing that he could do about this because the offensive player was lowering his helmet, and so the launch point changed for the defensive player, his target area changed because the offensive player lowered his helmet. That needs to be a penalty against the offense, but they are not calling it, even though that technically is the rule. Do I think that they should rule things more consistently in the preseason? Absolutely. Should they wait until the end of the preseason to then decide how they're going to legislate this? No, they need to be helping the officials every single week to figure it out and then potentially go back and modify something with the rule itself if they want to do that. But don't just modify the way that you're going to implement this rule. Do that on a proactive weekly basis. Do announcers need to get a better understanding of the rules so that they can sound more intelligent and educate the people at home? Absolutely. Is the rule itself problematic? Absolutely. Where do we go from here with the rule? I'm not sure. I just know those are some of the takeaways that I've seen so far this preseason, and I really hope things change over the next few weeks of preseason games.